And it says we are live. All right. Well, here we are for GEO Live number 22. I'm Josh.
Hey, I'm Chris.
Here with Chris, yes, as always. And there is a book that has been making the rounds for, I don't know, probably the last year or so. Very popular, called The Dawn of Everything. Last published book, I believe, or the first posthumously published book by David Graeber, along with David Wengrow, two anthropologists, and really, it's kind of like pop anthropology, I suppose. Kind of they're summing up and trying to do a little interpretation of a lot of contemporary anthropological findings, and then also just digging up some stuff that's been around for a long time but people don't seem to pay attention to. And I was reading it and I came across this section towards the beginning that is about when the French, when the first Europeans, I guess, or when the Europeans started interacting with people on the North American continent, there was a lot of, I think we kind of tend to have a kind of cartoonish view of how all that went, but there was a lot of trade, there was a lot of conversation, there was a lot of interaction between people from these two societies, and there was a lot written about the take that the indigenous people had on the French society. Some of them willingly and some of them unwillingly. Some of the indigenous folks had actually been to France and been back, and so they could say directly, not even just from their experience of the colonists. And it's pretty interesting. And I have to say, coming at it from a solidarity economy perspective and hearing people talk now about things like an economy of abundance, when I read what we're about to read now, I was like, this is it. This is what we're talking about. It already existed in America just before. So I just wanted to take a look through some of these sections. I kind of went through and picked out some of the good parts, and just thought I'd kind of read some of them, and then we can discuss. So here he's talking about, he said that the first interactions of the French with Algonquin-speaking Micmac people in Nova Scotia. Here he says, French assessments of the character of the savages, quote unquote, tended to be decidedly mixed. The indigenous assessment of French character was distinctly less so. Father Pierre Bayard, for example, was a former theology professor assigned in 1608 to evangelize the Algonquin-speaking Micmac in Nova Scotia, who had lived for some time next to a French fort. Bayard did not think much of the Micmac, but reported that the feeling was mutual. They consider themselves better than the French, for, they say, you are always fighting and quarreling among yourselves. We live peacefully. You are envious and are all the time slandering each other. You are thieves and deceivers. You are covetous and are neither generous nor kind. As for us, if we have a morsel of bread, we share it with our neighbor. They are saying these and like things continually. What seemed to irritate Bayard the most was the Micmac would constantly assert that they were, as a result, richer than the French. The French had more material possessions, the Micmac conceded, but they had other greater assets: ease, comfort, and time. So right there, like immediately, like this to me, this is the kind of the summing up this distinction. When people, when we're talking about an economy of abundance, to me, this is what that really means. It's not like everybody has a whole bunch of material possessions. That is an impossibility. So anyway, 20 years later, Brother Gabriel Sagard, a Recollect friar, I don't know what that is, wrote similar things of the Wendat nation. Sagard was at first highly critical of Wendat life, which he described as inherently sinful. He was obsessed with the idea that Wendat women were all intent on seducing him. Yes, of course they were. But by the end of his sojourn, he had come to the conclusion that their social arrangements were in many ways superior to those at home in France. In the following passages, he was clearly echoing Wendat opinion. They have no lawsuits and take little pains to acquire the goods of this life, for which we Christians torment ourselves so much, and for our excessive and insatiable greed in acquiring them, we are justly and with reason reproved by their quiet life and tranquil dispositions. End quote. Much like Bayard's Micmac, the Wendat were particularly offended by the French lack of generosity to one another. They reciprocate hospitality and give such assistance to one another that the necessities of all are provided for without there being any indigent beggar in their towns and villages, and they considered it a very bad thing when they heard it said that there were in France a great many of these needy beggars, and thought that this was for lack of charity in us, and blamed us for it severely. So again, we have this distinction, we have this, these two societies being put next to each other. And on the one hand, the French, who the rich Europeans, rich society, and that's, very, as we know, very individualistic, very materialistic, versus this other society where they are not individualistic, and thus, as a result, have much better lives. And in fact, they have, there's no poor people in their society. There's also no rich people. Like, these two things go together. Feel free to jump in here, Chris, if anything makes you think. The Wendat cast a similarly jaundiced eye at French habits of conversation. Sagard was surprised and impressed by his host's eloquence and powers of reasoned arguments, skills honed by near daily public discussions of communal affairs. His hosts, in contrast, when they did get to see a group of Frenchmen gathered together, often remarked on the way they seemed to be constantly scrambling over each other and cutting each other off in conversation, employing weak arguments, and overall, or so the subtext seemed to be, not showing themselves to be particularly bright. People who tried to grab the stage, denying others the means to present their arguments, were acting in the same way as those who grabbed the material means of subsistence and refused to share it. It is hard to avoid the impression that the Americans saw the French as existing in a kind of Hobbesian state of war, of all against all. Remember, when he says Americans, he is referring specifically to the Native Americans. It's probably worthy of remark. He says that, that the natives initially were dealing, specifically with mostly men. Societies, it was the European men who came over first, and so the towns and outposts and whatnot were even more devoid of care than than most European settlements. These accounts, so there were a number of accounts written about this, and I first became aware of these reading Vine Deloria Jr.'s The World We Used to Live In. He used a lot of these same sources in that book, because they're some of the best, kind of first-person accounts we have of some of these societies, even though they are written by oftentimes Jesuit priests. But the Jesuits often, will say things directly that in their mind is damning. But to us, it's like, oh wow, this is great. At any rate, so yes, the Jesuit relations was this book that made the rounds, had a lot of said included many a similar remonstrance aimed at the French by Wyandotte observers. One of the most striking things about these 71 volumes of missionary field reports is that neither the Americans nor their French interlocutors appeared to have very much to say about equality per se, except when they were speaking about equality of the sexes. It's kind of an interesting side note. He's talking about how we got began to talk, even think about in terms of equality at all. And one of the claims in the book, I guess, that making is that it was really this interaction between European society and American societies that kind of birthed the whole concept. Because on the one hand, the Europeans, it wasn't even something that had occurred to them, and on the other side, it was just how things were. So,
Yeah.
another go for it, Chris, please.
I remember when this came out because it changed the dialogue of quite a few white anarchists, and I felt like it had changed them, who they really were. Still fundamentally racist, but it gave them a new arsenal of rhetoric.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. The white anarchists were and are fundamentally racist.
Yeah, and anti-indigenous. Ones that I
and
know
they were using this.
They weren't. They would mention it, because that's part of a lot of the radical stuff is people love to talk and appear very intelligent, and part of that is quoting books and theory and oh, this and this and this. And this was, I was looking it up, yeah, this came out in 2021, and some of the I was browsing through it, some of these ideas.
Jeez, is that long ago?
Yeah.
Implies.
But yeah, that's what came to mind to me about how some of these people can revere this text, but they go on doing the same stuff, including the radicals.
Yeah,
but I mean, I'm looking at this and I'm curious about the people who weren't so polite in their criticisms of the Europeans. But anyways, go ahead.
We'll get to it. Yes. So there is a section later at the end where we get to hear directly from a Wyandotte, in his own words. And he's not pulling any punches. So to me, though, again, this is okay, because this is what I hear a lot of radicals do. And it really annoys me. They say things like, oh, people are finally waking up and we're evolving as a species and we're gonna, we're figuring this stuff out. And I'm like, we're not. Stuff is already been figured out. We're not, it's maybe the people in your society are getting a little bit more hip to some of these things, but it's not something new in the world. We don't have to reinvent it. And it's not something that's never been done before and we can only imagine and dream. It's no, we have concrete reality. It's just been forgotten and covered up largely. And those of us who are trying now to build a society based around meeting human needs and not just profit and individualism and materialism, this is what better place to be looking for what that actually looks like. I think there are not many better places. So anyway, this Jesuit missionary, 1642, commenting on the Montagne Nescapi, I probably said that incorrectly, says they imagine that they ought by right of birth to enjoy the liberty of wild ass cults, rendering no homage to anyone whomsoever except when they like. They have reproached me 100 times because we fear our captains while they laugh at and make sport of theirs. All the authority in their chiefs is in his tongue's end, for he is powerful insofar as he is eloquent, and even if he kills himself talking and haranguing, he will not be obeyed unless he pleases the savages. So, and yes, the archaic language.
That part reminds me of that. Have you ever heard of that book about Mbongi? I think it's called Mbongi. Let's see. Mbongi,
African?
yeah, an African traditional political institution. Yeah, there's
Where in Africa? Like, do you know?
there is a map in it about where the author says that this it's a form of self-governance, and they say it's a solution to the crisis in Africa. And there's a part, if I recall correctly, where they say that like when someone gets elected to power within that system, it's normal for there to even be like dances where they're taunting and mocking the people who are like have been elected or put into power.
Right. Yeah, which is, in reading this, I was reminded of, this is of course about peoples who are living on the eastern seaboard, but out, here where I'm at, reading the history of the Western, what's now the United States. That was one of the things that happened with the tribes on the plains. That is like the white people either didn't understand or chose not to understand that, it wasn't the case that some, elder for the tribe could sign a treaty and agree to something and then everybody else has to go along with it. That's just not how their society worked. And it's like, oh, that was not just with the tribal or with the plains tribes, but a common American thing. So this is why I love reading this stuff. It's like, okay, this, like, the way that I feel things should work is like traditional Americanism, really. Like when you get down to it. So here's what they thought of the French. He said, in the considered opinion of the Montagnes Nescapi, however, the French were little better than slaves, living in constant terror of their superiors. Such criticism appears regularly in Jesuit accounts. What's more, it comes not just from those who lived in nomadic bands, but equally from townsfolk like the Wendat. The missionaries, however, were willing to concede that this wasn't all just rhetoric on the Americans' part. Even Wendat statesmen couldn't compel anyone to do anything they didn't wish to do. As Father Lalemant, whose correspondence provided the initial model for the Jesuit relations, noted of the Wendat in 1644, I do not believe that there is any people on earth freer than they, and less able to allow the subjection of their wills to any power whatever, so much so that fathers here have no control over their children, or captains over their subjects, or the laws of the country over any of them, except insofar as each is pleased to submit to them. There is no punishment which is inflicted on the guilty, and no criminal who is not sure that his life and property are in no danger. Which seems a little extreme, that last part. But as he goes on to discuss, they had a system of justice. We talk about restorative justice. I think the system that he's going to describe is even better than that. It seems like even like, oh, wow, this is like a whole nother level. So after expanding on how scandalous it was that even murderers should get off scot-free, the good father did admit that when considered as a means of keeping the peace, the Wendat system of justice was not ineffective. Actually, it worked surprisingly well. Rather than punish the culprits, the Wendat insisted the culprit's entire lineage or clan pay compensation. This made it everyone's responsibility to keep their kindred under control. It is not the guilty who suffer the penalty, Lalemant explains, but rather the public that must make amends for the offenses of individuals. If a Huron had killed an Algonquin or another Huron, the whole country assembled to agree to the number of gifts due to the grieving relatives to stay the vengeance that they might take. So what do you think of that as a system?
I think how can a lot of people even get there? I mean,
well,
there's a lot of people who I openly tell them, I'm not gonna be part of any collective punishment of you. We're not close like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I go through great pain to make sure that I'm not gonna be part of a collective punishment um, of people who I'm not close to like that. And I think there's a lot of people who are the same way, and that's one of the serious things too about even just forming a co-op is that whole like, do you want to be collectively punished? I mean, and part, I guess another way of saying that is having the liability of someone else's actions.
Hmm.
Um, so like, there's a lot of people who don't want to do that in forming a business. Imagine a an association that's bigger than like the average size of a co-op of like 3 to 5 people in the U.S. or whatever.
Oh, this is so far beyond just a co-op,
Get to
though.
that point. Get to
Yeah,
that
yeah.
point.
I mean, this is a whole different society. So of course, we're talking where, and I guess I have some, I can kind of relate to what how this would work, because where I go and stay, when I was going to Nepal, would stay in a village that was very, well, all of the villages there are like a family. So I stayed in a place initially called Dahal Gown, which is Dahal town. Everybody who lives there's last name is Dahal. And then you go down the road and it's Galal Gown, and everybody who's their last name is Galal, right? And they have a similar sort of system, actually. Now that I think about it, is very communal. If it's your whole family, because you're living surrounded by people who you know and who you interact with, and who are relatives often, to one degree or another. Like, everybody keeps each other in line, and they don't have any like police or anything. But if somebody's being drunk and obnoxious, for instance, you know, several of the guys just get together from the community and go over and have a talking to them, and that's that. you know. But it's, but yeah, I don't, but this these ways of thinking, I think our thinking gets so constrained about how we could possibly do things, and so that's why I like reading stuff like this, because it's like there are very different ways, right? Like, humans are creative. We can build our societies in lots of different ways.
Yeah, it's not just thinking. There's something more complex about how can people even get to that point. I mean, I've seen a lot of sort of like leftist counterculture people trying to get to this point. And I think that these are the kinds of things they have in mind, but that type of cohesion that I don't see it develop. It seems that I kind of see like almost like a false consciousness or something, where on the one hand people want this stuff, but on the other hand, um, what it takes to get there is way more complex. And um, I don't like, I see like, I feel like there's like a shallowness in the affinity that people have
Mhm.
for each other, and or like that's just a small part of the equation of what makes stuff like that possible. And for others, I don't know what will make it possible,
I mean,
especially
mm.
where people are essentially like marauders and settler colonizers who just kind of go from one place to the other in habits of extraction. Um, yeah,
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the the question. I think we have to get over the idea of like thinking about how we're going to change all of society all at once. Like, I don't think that's how things work. Um, and even if you look at our most, impactful co-ops on the scene, like Mondrian, for instance, how did that start? It started very tiny with a small group of people and a priest, and, doing just stuff to working together to benefit themselves, and to help each other. And it just grows over time and over time. They don't start out asking like, well, how can we build an 80,000 employee worker co-op, thing that's got a university and a hospital and all these factories. And it's like, no, that's not the way to do it. So it's by analogy with this kind of thing, it's you start small. Like, I really think it's how it works. You start with things like susus and mutual aid funds, and stuff like you work on in Chicago, Chris, and that out of like we obviously don't have the good fortune to live in a society where everybody is just kind of like this. This isn't the norm, but I do think that we can make our little subcultures, um, and actually change how we are with each other, when we do know each other and trust each other. And it's not, know that somebody's not just coming through for a week or a month and taking off. So, but yeah, at any rate, back to the critiques, and how, again, if we want to have a real solidarity economy, these are the kind of ways we have to think. If we don't think like this, we're never getting that. So, like, here it is. Anyway, many societies, and the American societies of the time appear to have been among them. It would be quite inconceivable to refuse a request for food. For 17th century Frenchmen in North America, this was clearly not the case. Their range of baseline communism appears to have been quite restricted, did not extend to food and shelter, something which scandalized the Americans, again, the American Indians, Native Americans. But just as we earlier witnessed a confrontation between two very different concepts of equality, here we are ultimately witnessing a clash between very different concepts of individualism. Europeans were constantly squabbling for advantage. Societies of the Northwest woodlands, by contrast, guaranteed one another the means to an autonomous life, or at least ensured no man or woman was subordinated to any other man or woman. Insofar as we can speak of communism, it existed not in opposition to, but in support of individual freedom. Again, this is one of the things that it resonates. It just resonates with me so much, right? Like, because I try to get this, I've said things like this so many times to people and get looked at like you're just weird or you're crazy or what are you talking about? Like, for instance, when I was doing my undergrad in economics in my senior seminar, I tried to get my class to do a thought experiment of how, like, what if instead of how we do things now, we, for a year, say, or 5 years, you're not only allowed to spend money on other people. Like, nobody's allowed to spend money on themselves. Like, how would that change, the distribution of our income, stuff like, thinking like this. I tried to get people to said, like, okay, if you have it's kind of a Rousseauian thought experiment, I think. If you have, or probably getting the name wrong. Anyway, if you have the option of being born into one society in where everybody looks out for their own interests and everybody tries, like our society right here we're in now, or a society where nobody is looking out for their own interests, everybody's just looks out for the interests of people around them. Like, which one is the better one to be born into? Like, obviously the latter, right? Because you've got a whole bunch of people looking out for your best interests. You don't want this every man for himself mentality. You want all for one for all. Then, so anyway, again, this concept that your autonomy is ensured by the solidarity that people have with each other, and this lack of materialism and greed.
Well, this reminds me of two things. One is I've seen different writers, authors, I think maybe as early as like the 1700s, who would talk Europeans, always Europeans, and whenever they mentioned communism, well, maybe it wasn't as far back as the 1700s. Maybe it was the 1800s, late 1800s and on. They always saw it as a thing in which individuals get bullied by the group. And every time I saw that, I was like, man, y'all, like, this people like really traumatized, man. Like, they really don't trust their own people. Like, things are really messed up.
And what do you think's happening now, right? Like, are we not all being bullied? Like, I gotta go to work again? Like, dude, this guy's gonna kick me out of my house.
Then, yeah. But the thing about means to an autonomous life, though, like, I don't see how a lot of like this. I'm kind of curious and not curious. of how that's playing out in a lot of the solidarity economies in the USA. Because I think that a lot of the products and economies, they're still based on extraction. They're based on um like foreign dependence, like outside of the
Mhm.
region and all that. I'm like, it's not gonna happen. I think it's gonna require lots of scaling back, lots of
Oh
scaling
yeah,
back. Um, and
yeah. I don't.
similar language you see like in the Confederal concept of libertarian communism by the Spanish CNT.
Mhm.
But that was like that's what they wanted to do as part of the revolution was to give every region um, what do they say? Like a region is freer the less it's dependent on others, though they did want to foster interregional cooperation.
Mhm.
Um, and that's what the cooperatives are trying to do in Rojava today. That's why they really want to focus on like agriculture because they think that's like the basis of their autonomy and also eliminating the
Yeah.
money,
Yeah.
which
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
yeah. You got to be able to feed yourself. I mean, right? If you're not, if that's at somebody else's whim, then what autonomy do you really have, right? Um, yeah, and as he points out here, this it says everything operated. Okay, I'll start the sentence earlier here. The same could be said of indigenous political systems that Europeans encountered across much of the Great Lakes region. Everything operated to ensure that no one's will would be subjugated to that of anyone else. Um, that concept, like, not only was it a mind blower, I'm sure in the 1600s, I know it was for the Europeans who were coming across that. Like, what? Like, you don't have to follow somebody else's orders. But even nowadays, that is such a radical concept um, that the natural state of things, nobody has to do what anybody else says, unless you want to. Um, yeah. Anyway, so he says. Um, So now we get to the real juicy part in my mind, which is the right from the horse's mouth, as it were, from this gentleman named a Windot statesman named Kandiarank, and we know about his criticisms because he was the spokesman for the Windot, and he learned French. He probably traveled to France as a, um, you know, ambassador for his people. Spent a couple of years there. Definitely spent a lot of time in what is now Canada, conversing with various French officials and priests and military officers. And one of those officers, after he was kind of discredited, um, and had a bit of a fall from grace. He got dishonorably discharged or whatever, ended up down and out, and wrote his memoirs, and just went back through his diary and recounted a lot of these conversations that they had uh, with this Candiaronk, although he changed his name to Adario. For a long time, I'll say this, and this is what I had heard back 20 years ago when I was in college, that these that this book specifically and books like it were all just made up by the Europeans. That they had like critiques of their own societies, but they were afraid of putting their own names on it. And so the thing to do was like, oh, put it in the mouth of some native person, and then they can do the critique, and I don't have to get in trouble for it. Indigenous scholars nowadays have looked back on this and said, no, a lot of that stuff sounds exactly like what indigenous people would say, and there's good reason to think that it was not all just made up. And specifically, this was one of the first ones from this Lahonatan guy, um, and so yeah, he. Let's see. There we go. There's the indigenous scholars. Said All right. So there's every reason, we say, to believe that this man who's going to speak now is had been to France. Wendat Confederation sent an ambassador to visit Louis XVI in 1691. And Kandiaronk at the time was Speaker of the Council, which would have made him a logical person to send. So seems likely when he speaks of French society, he knows what he was speaking of. I'll skip past that since it was just more Europeans reporting what the natives had said or what the indigenous people had said. So here, let's give the floor to Kandiaronk himself. The first of the dialogues is about religious matters, blah, blah, blah. Okay, sorry. I have a bookmark. I have this bookmarked. Here we go. I have spent 6 years reflecting on the state of European society, says Kandiaronk, and I still can't think of a single way they act that's not inhuman, and I genuinely think that this can only be the case as long as you stick to your distinctions of mine and thine. I affirm that what you call money is the devil of all devils, the tyrant of the French, the source of all evils, the bane of souls and slaughterhouse to the living. To imagine one can live in the country of money and preserve one's soul is like imagining one could preserve one's life at the bottom of a lake. Money is the father of luxury, lasciviousness, intrigues, etc. In light of all this, tell me that we Wendat are not right in refusing to touch or so much as look at silver. Do you seriously imagine, he says, that I would be happy to live like one of the inhabitants of Paris, to take 2 hours every morning just to put on my shirt and makeup, to bow and scrape before every obnoxious galoot I meet on the street who happened to have been born with an inheritance? Do you really imagine I could carry a purse full of coins and not immediately hand them over to people who are hungry, that I would carry a sword but not immediately draw it on the first band of thugs I see rounding up the destitute to press them into naval service? Again, so here we go. Here's the attitude of somebody coming from an actual like solidarity economy society. Like how many people in our movements, I don't know, think like this. I have had this line right here, this one right here. You imagine I could carry a purse full of coins and not immediately hand them over to people who are hungry. Like I've gotten myself, I wouldn't say I've got myself in trouble. I've certainly gotten myself criticized a lot over the years because I couldn't help myself. It's like, okay, even though I don't have anything, like I can't just stand by and let this other person have absolutely nothing. And I discovered at some point in my early adulthood that is not a normal attitude to have in our country. So it's nice to see that other people in other places have also had it. And here, Kandiaronk kind of sums it up by saying, over and over, I have set forth the qualities that we would not believe ought to define humanity: wisdom, reason, equity, and demonstrated the existence of separate material interests knocks all these on the head. A man motivated by interest cannot be a man of reason. So, again, the radical concept, what he is saying is at the root of our issues as a society, which I think they're still the same issues. The existence of separate material interests. Like,
I think it's deeper than that. I think it's the tip of the iceberg.
You think that's just the tip of the iceberg?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I'm not saying that's everything, but this is, I mean, so I wrote about this. I wrote a blog recently. I don't imagine you read it, but one of the things I talked about in there was the getting criticized by people from other cultures for my Americanness, like things that I wouldn't even think were worthy of being criticized or I wouldn't have thought of. For instance, when I was going to the university, these 20 some years ago, I had gotten like a loan for like $1,500 or something from my parents to help cover tuition back when you could actually cover tuition for a couple $1,000s. And, they'd had me sign a little agreement to pay him back and whatnot. And when I told my economics advisor this, he was appalled. It's like, you Americans, you treat your own family like bankers. Like, that's ridiculous. And then when I was in Nepal, and I brought my dad along with me and a couple of my friends, my Nepali friends, and him and I, went on a little trek because my dad wanted to go see the Himalayas or go up into the Himalayas. So as we're like traveling, my friends wanted to go to some fancy restaurant or something. And they said, oh, hey, let's go, eat here. And I said, well, dad's the one with the money. So if you want to eat someplace fancy, you got to like ask him. And they were so confused. And they said to me, Bako paisa, Timro paisa, haina. Like, your father's money is your money, isn't it? Like, it was mind blowing to them that a father and a son, despite the fact that I was an adult, I'm like in my 20s, 30s, that we would have this distinction, that we would make a distinction between his money and my money when we're in the same family. He is my father and I'm his son. Like, so the way that we think about things, when I say this existence of separate material interests, I think that is deep, and we don't even get how deep that is. Maybe it's not like this for everybody. At some point I decided like, oh, maybe this is just like a middle-class white person thing. But I've talked to some middle-class black people who have very similar experiences. So
yeah, I don't think we should underestimate just how messed up we are. But that part that you just read, though, it reminded me of this. I mean, I don't know what I don't know what the situation is anymore, because there's many laws that like a lot of people are like, man, we're just not going to follow that. But there was this. I remember there was this period in San Antonio. I'm going to share this. I'm going to share this screen. Let's see.
yeah, go for it.
Where it became illegal to like feed houseless people or homeless people.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this article from 2015. It says right here that this person got a $2,000 ticket, a citation that carries a $2,000 fine for feeding the homeless. It says here. Like, dude, that's just what you read. That's like going on in San Antonio very recently. It goes even further, man. You get punished.
Yeah.
But fortunately, though, I mean, even though that stuff was happening, I do remember, like, on the heels of that, a bunch of us were just still doing it. We're still we didn't care. We're gonna do it, like, and I think part of that was they were trying to suppose that there's like this unique, like, one-stop shop for helping out people who are experiencing houselessness. It's called Haven for Hope. I think it was tied to that, where they wanted to centralize all the like care. So they wanted to rip that out from being something that people would do in their various localities in San Antonio, and everybody would be forced to send them to the central location. And that was really, when I saw it, I was like, man, that's such a bizarre thing to criminalize those sentiments and those practices. And that's probably like a mass social lobotomy that we probably don't even understand what type of damage it's done up until this day. But if San Antonio is getting worse and worse, and I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of that is due to things like that, where you make it a crime to take care of each other. Okay, what do you think's going to happen? Society's going to get even more brutal.
Well, I mean, hopefully, though, enough people just refuse. I mean, that's where it's like you just have to keep doing that. And yeah, it's so ironic, especially with often conservative folks who are into this sort of thing, or also claim to be Christians, and it's like, oh yes, how very Christian to stop somebody from feeding the poor. It's
and there were churches that opposed it too, though.
Yeah.
Because they're hey, that's kind of like what we do. That's a normal thing of what we do. We don't know why you would take that away from us.
Yep. Well, yeah. I mean, well, we know it's right because they want to control that population. They want to keep them centralized. Yeah, I think a lot of it's just control fetish. But yeah, no, San Antonio's not the only place. There are a lot of places that have passed ordinances against feeding people, you know, with without a commercial license and all that stuff. Food not bombs has gotten flack in a lot of different places for that, but you just keep doing it, and we ran an article recently that Megan McGee wrote about the mutual aid efforts after Hurricane Helene in Asheville, North Carolina, that ended up centering kind of organically around an anarchist bookstore there called Firestorm. Thank you. Firestorm Books. And that kind of like that to me again, shows us like, okay, well, what happens when everybody has to just like immediately go back to like just fundamentals, and we end up with a lot of mutual aid going on and people acting in the manner that Kandiaronk and the Wendat and the Huron and the Haudenosaunee were talking about, when they're in their cultures, like the natural way to be, which is to share and try to make sure everybody gets taken care of. And if you have a morsel of bread, you share it with your neighbor. So, and I mean, and this is what, so I was shocked. I was actually shocked when I was like 19 or something. I was probably 19 when I figured this out, like it clicked in my head because of some life experiences I had. And I was doing what I was raised to do. I was living out the values that I've been raised with. And all of a sudden the people who had put those values into me were like, what are you doing? Right? Like sharing, for instance, right? Like sharing is the basic one. We tell all our kids, share. You got to share your stuff. You can't take you don't take snacks to school unless you have enough for everybody in the class, right? But as soon as you turn 18 and you're out in the world, if you keep up that attitude, you're insane, right? There's something wrong with you. You're not going to get ahead. You're not going to ruin your life. What are you going to give all your money away? What do you do? Sharing. What do you mean sharing? You need to invest. You need to invest, not share. and if you feel bad about having something because not everybody else has it, well, that's just like, that's a you thing. It's not, you shouldn't feel, there's no reason to feel bad about that. And I didn't get it like that. For me, like those values stuck. Like, I'm sorry, you've made me like this. Now I've got no choice. Somebody, asked me for something and I can provide it. I'm going to have a real hard time saying no. And I'm going to have a real hard time trying to focus on just filling up my bank account and, surrounding myself with as much fancy stuff as I can, when I've been around enough to know what the situation is in the world, what most people can hope for materially. Like, I just can't do that. Like, I cannot commit my life to doing that. Like, because of the values that I got, like, as a child coming up. And it's like, those values, those were the right ones. The ones that we give our kids, they're correct. And we go wrong when we drop them when we become adults. And reading this book and reading specifically about these societies, it's like, here's what a society is like when you keep those values.
I think the schools carefully though paved the way of rooting those out. There's like a twin thing going on, because that's the thing that sticks out with me when I try to do substitute teaching. How like at the young age, I noticed that the kids, they were still not down with like the prime directive, which is to have a relationship with that book or with those books. and those tests. That's like the prime directive of schooling. Have a relationship with those tests and those exams and those books, rather than the relationship with their peers. And so when they're like the younger they are, the more, well, the younger we are, the more like the social priority is to take care of each other. And I had to get out of there quick, man, because I felt pretty evil telling kids like, hey, you need to look at this book instead of letting the kids just succor each other when they're in pain. That natural instinct, right? So replacing the relationship with people, the relationship with books, or relationship with text. And it's what's really eerie is how by a certain age we're already trained to stop doing that, to stop like dropping everything and taking care of each other. I think I saw it by like third or fourth grade. That's what I saw. Starts pretty young. That's why, yeah, I'm not really into a lot of the schools and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, but I don't think the problem is not with encouraging kids to have a relation to text. I mean, God, I loved reading as a kid. This is not because anybody at school told me. It's because I love the stories. I love, getting lost in them. But I mean, to me, I think everybody must do the same thing. It's the standardization. You have to sit in the rows. You got to sit down, shut up, be quiet, do all these like unkid-like things.
Yeah.
And it's, there's a book, God, I can't remember the guy's name. It's Gotti. His last name is like Gotti.
John Gatto.
Gatto. Yeah. You know who I'm talking about. That teacher. And he said, like back in the day, that was the industrialists who wanted to, they helped set up the American education system in order to create good factory workers. Essentially, you're training people to sit in one place, do boring tasks for long periods of time, follow orders, do what they're told. You're not trying to train them to be free thinkers and stuff like that. And at some point, when I was growing up, it was still, we only had standardized tests like fill in the bubble like twice during my whole primary school, grade school career or whatever. And now I think they do them like twice a year or maybe more, like standardized tests, to where, and then the tests themselves.
And everything's a lead up to it. Everything's like a lead up to
it. Yeah. And it's just teaching to the tests, but then the tests themselves, when I started reading the tests themselves often had just massive typos on them, had all kinds of bad information, had not been properly proofread. It was, and so I'm like, well, what even are we doing? We're not even trying to make good like factory workers anymore. It feels like to me, my like conspiratorial mind is like, I think we're just trying to make good inmates. At this point, they're just trying to make, like, it doesn't even matter if you learn anything at all. Like, at least when you were working in the assembly line, we wanted you to know some basic math. But if all we got planned for you is the inside of a prison cell. But anyway,
it'd be interesting to hear what. So there's this comment, indigenous more like tribal. It'd be interesting to see an expansion of that idea.
Yeah. That's I actually. So on that comment, I'll cut you off, Chris, only to talk about the comment. Okay. So I was wondering about this because I started thinking, isn't it weird, like the term indigenous, like we don't talk about like a white guy living in France who has, hundreds of generations of his family or whatever from that same place in France. We don't talk about him as being indigenous, right? Like and so it's like, wait a minute, does indigenous mean like you were colonized? Like, is that part of the definition? And it seems like it kind of is almost, which makes it a strange kind of word, a strange kind of definition, like to be defined by somebody else's, what somebody else, or relation with somebody else. I don't know what the right word is though.
Different meanings. Yeah, different meanings. And it might be good at some point to be able to expand on some of those terms.
I mean, what do you think,
Um,
Chris?
I'm as long as colonization exists, I think it's good to think of indigenous within like the framework of who's invading someone else and who's not, who's actively participating in that or not. Um, but the John Gatto, though, I mean that it's interesting because like he was an award-winning teacher, and
Mhm. Teacher of the year.
I it's interesting how he basically said that he got paid to participate in like glorified state-sanctioned child abuse. Um, but it also reminds me though of I was reading this book a long time ago. It was about Vladimir Lenin, and it said that Inessa Armand was his mistress. Have you ever heard of
Mhm.
any of this?
Well,
Um,
I know of those personages only because of the last one only because of the Revolutions podcast. Mike Duncan.
yeah, I think the book was called. Let me see. I think I found it. Lenin's Mistress: The Life of Inessa Armand by Michael Pearson. I don't
Mhm.
know. I don't know to what extent this stuff is true, but I remember reading that book a long time ago, and supposedly Lenin was telling Inessa to propose to, I think it was like a women's congress. I don't know, it was like a Soviet women's congress or what. Basically, the American school system, like what we see today, like this public, and the reaction of the women supposedly was like there was just like a uproar of hatred for the system, and the women were like, "You're trying to steal our children from us." um. Anyways, we're getting into the education, but it's all related though. It's all related. Um. Like
Yeah.
I can't imagine um the pre-European contact inhabitants of the west of this hemisphere voluntarily um, and with full knowledge of the facts doing these school systems. They'd be the same. Like, why would you do that? That's
Mm.
abuse. You know.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, that's one of the things that Graeber and Wengrow point out is that our current child rearing practices in this country and in Europe, um, we basically got from the Native Americans. Like that was we picked that up from them. Like, you know what Europeans did with our kids, right? We put them in factories. You know, those tiny hands do good work. You were, children are meant to be seen and not heard, kind of thing. But the again, it was part of this whole like kind of European Enlightenment thing. A lot of it was sparked by Europeans seeing another society and like, oh, those people do things way different, and actually seems a lot more humane. Maybe we should do that too, you know. But yeah.
but yeah, I do got to do a disclaimer though. I'm not these
Yeah.
native folks. It's not my right to tell their story. So I just want to say that I would love to hear, the descendants of these people mentioned here talk about, their past, and I do. I wouldn't be surprised if I do know some of these folks. Because the First Nations folks in Chicagoland, they do
Hmm.
have these connections around the Great Lakes into Canada.
Hmm.
And because of displaced because of the forced displacement, now they even have broader connections throughout the
Hmm.
uh,
Yeah, yeah.
so-called USA. Um,
But
but
I
yeah.
mean, yeah, because I really think like, and that would be great if there are people who still have that uh, have that knowledge in from other sources. Like, unfortunately, like even indigenous scholars like looking into this stuff. Like I said, I first became aware of all the Jesuit stuff through Vine Deloria Jr., who's an indigenous scholar and writer. But anyway, if we anybody who has that, like I said, I think this is where we should be taking cues from. you know so it's like, yeah, if we're serious about solidarity economy, if we're serious about economy of abundance and all this stuff, and it's not just some buzzwords to make us feel good while we're living in capitalism, like we should probably find out about people who actually lived in economies that look like that, in societies that look like those, similar to what we want to live in, and find out how they were different than us, and what you find out, I mean, even just the little multiculturalism that I've experienced, people have different ways of thinking about things. And once you figure out, and often you're not even aware of how you think about something until you interact with somebody who thinks about it way differently. And then it, casts some light on it. So I
Yeah,
think we
and
have
I
much to
I want
learn.
to see Europeans take up the responsibility of finding out that stuff as it happened in Europe. I don't believe a lot of this history, and I feel like there's this assumption all the time that Europe is just too jacked up that there's nothing good that like ever existed there. I feel
Oh,
like
no.
that's kind of like an assumption that pervades, and so even a lot of Europeans, like, they're just like, oh, let's mine the global south for knowledge instead of like taking up the responsibility of like, dude, rescue your societies, they're jacked up,
Yeah.
they need help. What existed prior to all this chaos, or what exists today that's still good and not premised on extraction of the global south? um
Well, I
and
mean,
and I'll
it,
tell
it
the European folks, don't tell me what that information is, keep it sacred, it's like stuff that they'll
you
kill you
don't want to
for.
know.
Those
I want to
European
hear about the
elites.
Putney debates.
No, it's just that like those European elites, I know that they don't want you to uncover that stuff. So keep that to yourself. Don't risk your own life. Nurture it, keep it, grow it in secret
Oh,
until you can like expand it even more.
oh, it's there, and we know. I mean, it's kind of a touchy issue, and I mean, this is a definitely, it starts to get touchy because here's a deal, because it's not real cool to be proud of your European heritage or your white heritage. Like, you're immediately sus if you say that. If you're like going around trying to understand your roots, in Scandinavia or Germany or the, British Isles or something, um, especially on the left, like that doesn't get that's often looked at as kind of sus. And so a lot of people don't know, like, the Putney debates, and the debates around the closing of the commons, the enclosure of the commons, and stuff like that, from our European history, much less the Gallic societies pre-Roman conquest and all that. Um, but yeah, we have to go back a lot further. I personally, I'm an advocate of our shared human legacy. Like, I think it's too late in the day to be worried too much about, like, but like we need to learn, all of us from everywhere. Like, it's not, it's if yeah, if we're gonna make it at all. um so yeah, that's my view, but I'm just a little old me. So we are at an hour 03. um I don't know, it's interesting. I'm a big reader, Chris. So thanks for indulging me in talking about one of the things I've been reading that I've been really into. So
It's funny how like, dude, I'm at that. I've been doing that for like 10 years too, where I'm like, hey, this came out last year. It was like 4 years ago.
well, I just
It's a
I
sign
just
of aging,
found it.
right?
I know. I'm like, what? And then I'm like, wait a minute. When Graeber died in like 2021? Yeah. Oh Jesus. Oh, it's 2025. 3 years. I mean, but it was like, okay, 2 years where I wanted to read it, and then I finally got it. So it's new to me.
And yeah, for supposedly that Michael Pearson is kind of like a slanderer. I think I've heard that. I don't know if that's true. So take that all that stuff with a grain of salt. The Pearson stuff. I think, was it Pearson that wrote the what is it, the one about the train? Did you ever hear about that one?
I don't think so.
Um, did he write that one? The Seal Train. Yeah. I wonder if anyone. So I don't know if that's true. I mean, I would have taken that deal. The one where, so supposedly, so during the Russian Revolution, people were saying that Lenin was like a sellout to the Germans because he made a deal with the Germans to go to Russia and like sow chaos. Um, and I believe in the SEAL Train, Michael
Mhm.
Pearson basically says, "Well, that was true. He did take that deal." And I'm like, "Why
I th-
wouldn't Lenin take that deal? I think I
I
would
think
have
he
taken
did.
that deal."
Yeah.
Um,
No. Yeah. The enemy
to
of
go
my
make
enemy is my
revolution in another
friend.
country,
Right.
in my
Well.
home country.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, oh man, that whole history is so. Uh, I don't like one. I don't think those are the people we necessarily want to be like learning from. Frankly, like actually, they're
Well,
not the
shoot,
people we want to be learning from.
that's what Kropotkin said. Like, do what we're learning
Yeah.
from the Bolsheviks is how not to do stuff.
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, uh, yeah. How they ended up getting in control. I mean, the funny thing to me was like in reading about the Russian Revolution was realizing that all these the Bolsheviks and a whole bunch of other people spent decades trying to start a revolution, trying to get something going. Going to the peasants, going to the people, trying to rouse people, trying all this education stuff. Nothing works, and then it just happens because there's a bad winter and the czar is an idiot and he does some stupid stuff and people just revolt, and all of a sudden there's a revolution happening. And what the Bolsheviks were good at was just being cutthroat, cutthroat politically, and jumping in front of the mob and saying, "All right, we're leading the parade," and then enough people went along with it that they made it work. But I mean, a lot of political dirty tricks um, that got him into power. So everything that comes after that, and then reading the history of the Soviet Union, something that never gets mentioned by commentators on this, but is like the one big standout thing to me was like the how repeatedly, over and over and over, the Soviet Union would stab leftists, like third world leftists especially, in the back in order to try to make nice with America. It was always what they were doing. The Soviet Union signed off on some CIA, inspired plot to kill the socialist prime minister of Italy. Like the Soviets gave the go ahead for
Man, man.
that. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Fidel Castro was pissed at Khrushchev because Khrushchev, after saying, "Oh yeah, we'll put the missiles here," then goes and makes a deal with Kennedy behind Fidel's back and doesn't stick with Fidel. As soon as he has a chance to make nice with Kennedy, he does it. And Fidel was pissed. And then same thing with like the African socialists. They weren't getting any support, real meaningful support from the USSR. And the USSR was always willing to share a little information with the CIA, about some problematic leftist someplace if they thought, yeah, it was, yeah,
I don't
it
know
was,
how deep some of that went, but I would not be surprised if that's true. Um, the the
it was,
only the only the only one where I've kind of seen a lot of information was with the Spanish Revolution and how the Soviet Union did not want they wanted to appease Germany so much that they're like,
yeah.
we got to destroy this revolution. We cannot like afford for uh, this pact between the Soviet Union and Germany to not evolve and stay in place.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the Grand Camouflage was the first book that came out about that, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, interesting stuff, man. I'm glad you touched upon the mobs because I've been wanting to read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Red Wheel. Where
Oh,
have you heard of that one?
I have not. Uh-uh.
But he basically talks. He said that in The Red Wheel, he wants to talk to people about how the mobs played a key role in in the rise of like Bolshevism and terror, and like the politics of terror. Um, and because a lot of people, I think people even today underestimate the power of mobs to be used mainly for authoritarian purposes. Um, and yeah, Alexander Solzhenitsyn really has some stuff to say about that.
Wait, when you say mobs, do you mean like organized crime or do you mean masses of people?
I believe what Solzhenitsyn was referring to was masses of people
Okay.
that and how like they were manipulated and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
it's stuff that a lot of times I'm like, I don't want to study that, but unfortunately, it's kind of like I feel it like a lot of times you got to keep studying power because it
Yeah.
keeps winning.
Yeah. Well, and you gotta. It's like, oh man, I'm blanking on the woman's name. Famous economist, and she said the reason you study economics is to keep from being fooled by economists. Um, that is the same kind of thing with studying the mechanisms of political power, so you can be aware of them when they're happening. It's why I think it's so in my I don't know the last like 5-10 years or something like that. I don't know. I've been reading up a lot on like Cold War history, and like I said, what stood out to me is how off what we were told about what was going on was as compared to now with hindsight what we can see actually was happening. Like I said, on the one hand, we have in the US, we were told the commies are trying to take over the world. They want to expand and they want to invade us and they want to, they just hate us. And meanwhile, the Soviets are over there pulling their hair out, trying to figure out what can we do to make nice with the Americans and just get them to like leave us alone, like anything. Who do we have to stab in the back? Who do we have to hand over to you for interrogation? We'll do whatever. I mean, that was like the reality of it. They were not, and it was just the disconnect there, because the Soviets, they just wanted to run their country. They just want to like, let's just do our authoritarian thing in our country. And we have, we're over here like, we're going to nuke you at any moment, with like credibly threatening that. It's just, yeah.
That's
Anyway, I think
That's
it's interesting to like understand our how our own propaganda machine worked. I think
And
a
it worked
big
really
key,
well though
I think a
for
big
their
key to understand.
purposes.
Yeah. A big key to understanding it is from Ollie North's testimony before the Senate committee. I believe it was one of the senators asked him, you ran this Iran Contra, guns for drugs and money, thing, secretly for years. How did you do this in secret? And Ollie North said, we didn't. It wasn't a secret. It was all over Pravda. It was on the front page of like the main newspaper in Moscow. But you don't read Pravda. We didn't have to hide it from anybody. We just had to hide it from Americans. Right? And it's easy. Just make sure it's not in the American paper and Americans don't know about it. And I have found this out many times. Like I discovered, I don't know if you remember who Jessica Lynch was. Does that name ring a bell? From the
No.
first 2003 Iraq war. She was a soldier. I think she was a mechanic or something with the army, and she was captured by the Iraqi forces. And then they dropped her off at a hospital as they were retreating. And then she was supposedly rescued by American like special forces. I was listening to, and we had like just gotten this. It was all big, oh boy, exciting, dramatic story on the news. And then like a couple of months after the story broke, I was listening to CBC, Canadian Broadcasting, and they had an interview with some Iraqi doctors from the hospital where she was supposedly rescued from. And they said, so yeah, here's what happened. Iraq military comes through. They're like retreating. They drop off this wounded American soldier at the hospital, and then they hit the road, right? They're gone. We fix her up. We get her stable. She's fine. We put her in the ambulance, and we start driving her back towards the Americans to the American checkpoint to bring her back. And as we approach in the ambulance, they start firing at us at the checkpoint. So we turned around and go back to the hospital. The next day or the day after that, all of a sudden, just out of nowhere, bunch of guys in flak jackets bust through the doors of the hospital, with their assault rifles and their flak jacket and they've got camera crew with them. And we actually saw that, they showed it on TV, and they they start firing, and the doctor was like, everybody like ducked, but then pretty soon everybody like stood back up because they realized there's no bullets coming out of the guns. They're firing blanks. It's completely for show.
Whoa.
And they rescue Jessica Lynch, like they grab her out of the hospital bed, like take her out. I don't know if they bothered to sign her out or not. Probably not. and this Iraqi doctor was just like, we were like, WTF? Like, we tried to return her, and now they're saying that they rescued her. And I tried to tell my family that, like, I told my dad, I told my mom, my sister, I'm like, I heard this on CBS, or CBC radio, this is all nonsense. And they're like, what are you talking about? Blah, blah, blah. And then 4 years later, it was in the Washington Post. It came out that, yeah, that had been staged.
That it definitely was staged. That it was a fake rescue.
Yeah. I think like Rumsfeld or Cheney admitted it or something.
Like, look, man, you signed up. When you signed up, you explicitly signed up for fake rescues.
It was good for the cameras, but it's like I didn't even have to go listen to like Al Jazeera or South China Morning Post or something. It was just Canadian broadcasting, and they had like real stuff.
That's true though. Like
media,
there's some stuff where I'm like, man, it's probably there on some .gov, but I don't feel like going in and looking for it because a lot of times the U.S. and like they're very, they have a very how do you say, like very boring, monotone way of admitting the most horrible things. It's there. It's kind of like when like if you ever had the math problems in the book and then and it's not just like the numbers you're dealing with, they just turn it into like a word problem. It's kind of like that, where it's like you got to look at it like, oh, that's what they're saying.
Right. Yeah. Decode it.
Man, things are picking things. Another time we're like, I want to stay on, but I got to go do stuff.
Okay.
I got to go shopping and take care of some other things. But yeah, well, I'll catch you next time. What else?
Yeah, it's been great chatting. I hope our viewers have enjoyed our little ramble.
Going off the rails.
I think that going off the rails is probably more entertaining and just better content than when we try to like, oh, let's talk about this specifically. It's like, all right. But anyway, when we just start riffing on politics, it's fun.
Yeah.
All right. So, well, we will be back again in a month. And hopefully with some guests next month. So we got some people we're trying to get on. So we'll see.
The guests are pretty good. I think things are usually, especially if people get a heads up with the guests, I think it's usually pretty good. Yeah. All right. I got to go to the restroom. Shopping. Right. Good night, man.
We're out.